Okay, so switching gears, now that we have identified a problem, put it on the agenda, formulated some response, legitimated the choices, implemented through the organization, or figured out how we're going to implement, we have to figure out how in the hell we're going to pay for this. And that's where we tie into budget allocation as a major step within public policy and within the public policy process. As the President of the United States, it is increasingly difficult to manage the budget. We have what we call system-level allocations, and that's one of the major first issues. With system-level allocations, we're looking at questions like how many activities or problems justify government interventions? Could we best serve the interests of society by keeping the money in the hands of businesses or individuals? How do equity, equality, and economic growth help the public sector? They're really just looking at, should we spend? How should we spend? And then the second aspect is, how do we go ahead once we've decided to spend and determine who should get the money? Which programs get the money? Because even with deficit spending, the federal government is largely operating as a zero-sum game. A zero-sum game meaning that if the dollars go to program X, those dollars are not going to program Y. So for a president, you're sitting there and looking at, number one, people questioning whether you need to be getting this money in the first place or trying to solve a problem in the first place. And then number two, even if you convince them, who's best suited to do it? Characteristics of the federal budget. Number one, it is an executive budget. An executive budget basically meaning that it's being done at the top level. It has not always been this way. Before 1921, our federal budget was a legislative budget. It involves the executive office of the president. That's where a lot of the budget power has gone, because that's where the Office of Management and Budget is. A lot of this takes part within the executive branch. It is a line item budget, meaning that it allocates funds into different categories. Now, this makes things much easier, but it also can inhibit the effectiveness of good government because it limits how money can be spent. One of the biggest criticisms of the line item budget is that we would be better suited if we just gave a manager an unrestricted budget and then judged them based on how well they met the goals of their program or policy using that budget. And then it's an annual budget. We do this every year. We do the same song and dance routine every single year. Now, we do worry about long-term implications. We do ask for 5-year forecasts with OMB. But at the end of the day, Congress likes the annual budget because it guarantees that they have more say than they would otherwise. If they didn't, we would have bigger concerns and problems to be concerned with. But for a member of Congress, the fact that it happens every year guarantees that they always have their hand constantly in the pot. Now, the budget cycle. How does this work? The first step in the budget cycle is that we develop an estimate of the total size of the budget. And this will happen 16 months before the budget goes into effect. So in June 2014, we will be figuring out the estimates for the budget that will go into effect in October 2016. This helps us know what the presidential strategy is. We estimate tax revenues. We estimate fixed uncontrollable spending. And there are three parties to this situation. First, the Council of Economic Advisors, which is there basically representing the president. And this three, by the way, combined are referred to as the Troika. The Office of Management and Budget, which is there sort of representing the expenditure community as much as possible. And then the Treasury, which is there representing the financial community. And the Treasury is the part of the Troika that is always looking for the balanced budget. The Federal Reserve in recent years has started to play a role. That's still kind of being hashed out and figured out as we go through the budget process. Step 2, agency requests. Each agency prepares an initial list of what they need to fulfill their goals for that next year. On their request, they want to be aggressive but reasonable. You want to go for lots of money. There's nothing worse than OMB coming back and saying we were planning on giving you $2 billion, but you only asked for $1.2 billion, so thank you for giving us the extra funding. And you need to be careful with strategic choices. There are ways to play the budget game to help you on one individual year. But what you need to realize is if you play the game and you get caught, you're going to be punished in future years. So there's always that battle. Then we have executive review. So we figure out what the budget's likely going to be. We have the agencies figure out what they need. And then we go through executive review where it gets passed on to the Office of Management and Budget for review. They hold hearings, they have budget examiners, they go through and look at what's necessary, what's not necessary, what they can fund, what they can't. And the entire goal of this, after getting through a director's review, is that by January 15th, it's off to Congress, or within 15 days of Congress convening. The presidential budget at that point is prepared through OMB, and it's sent to Congress for their consideration. Then we go to congressional action, and this is where it can get messy, because the president has crafted an executive budget, and now Congress has to approve it, which means they have an opportunity to alter it as they see fit. There are budget committees in both bodies of Congress, obviously the most important being the House Appropriations Committee. Individuals serving on these budget committees typically have expertise, some ties to some agencies. What we've noticed in the last few years, especially, my God, this year and last year, there's more scrutiny at the overall House level. It used to be when it came out of the appropriations committees, it was just widely accepted as being okay. Now people are still fighting it. It really needs to get through Congress by September 15th so we can be set to go with a new budget by October 1st, trying to avoid passing unnecessary continuing resolutions. There has to be a second bill passed through that typically looks at debt ceilings, spending floors, fiscal policy. Ultimately, though, remember when we talked about the whole how a bill becomes a law, and we said that if the House passes one version and the Senate passes another, you need to be able to reconcile the two. That's still the case with budget bills. The Senate allows for earmarks and pork barrel. The House typically doesn't. So you need this reconciliation bill by September 25th. So by September 15th, we need both bodies of Congress to have agreed on their version of the budget. And then they have 10 days to get us to the 25th so that by October 1st we can be up and running without continuing on previous year's budget numbers. In terms of the actual execution of the budget, most agencies get their money on a quarterly basis. Some are different. The National Park Service is a good example. It gets most of its money over the summer when there's more tourists, more campers, more traveling, all of those things. The president, and we never like to talk about this, has the ability to impound funds. And what we mean when we say impound funds, Congress has passed something. They have said that we want to appropriate the money. The president disagrees with the appropriation, and the president simply says, I'm not going to do this. Richard Nixon was a huge fan of impounding money, so much so that they had to pass the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 to try to prevent it in the future. There are two different ways we can look at types of impoundment. The first being rescissions. Rescissions are cancellations of budgetary authority to spend money. So if you can say that a program is going to reach its goal with less money than is currently allocated to it, or that there's no good reason to spend the money, you can request from Congress rescission. If the president requests rescission, Congress has to act positively on that request within 45 days. If it doesn't, the money is made available to the agency for obligation. So again, the president makes the request and Congress can simply choose to do nothing. And if you look at Table 7.1 of the book, you see that this is something that's been used quite a lot. And again, it's not always successful, typically about a 30% success rate. Now, it's ironic to point out that Reagan proposed 602 rescissions. Clinton proposed 186. Bush proposed 1. And Obama has yet to use it. So that's important to keep in mind. This is not used a lot. And then there's also deferrals, which are requests to delay making the obligational authority available to the agency. And unless some body of the House exercises its veto power, this happens. So again, the idea of just trying to defer that payment over time. And this is not quite as serious or concerning as rescissions, where you're actually just trying to take the money away. So what are the problems we face in the budget process? Number one is obviously the deficit. The fact that we can deficit spend puts us in always a peculiar fiscal position where we have to worry and think about, we can spend money to do this, but ultimately someday we're going to have to pay it back. Someday, somewhere, this money is going to return, and we're going to have to figure out what we're going to do to pay for it. The issue is we make the deficit look smaller than it really is because we account for Social Security money, which is actually uncontrollable, which makes the deficit look actually smaller. If you look at Table 7.2 in the book, you look at the differences. In 1997, if we accounted for Social Security revenues as being budget dollars, the deficit was $22 billion. If you look at it without Social Security, it was $103 billion. If you look at 2010 with Social Security, $1.216 trillion. Without Social Security, $1.293 trillion. So we account for that, but that Social Security money is never going to go towards the budget. It's going into the bathtub and it will be drained out the other side. So it's kind of funny accounting, and it makes us look like we're in much better shape than when in reality we actually are. We try to strengthen our accounting standards to take account of obligations such as unfunded pensions and other things, but we're not perfect on that yet. We look at kind of a cash accounting system rather than looking at obligations being created for the future. We know that when a program's passed, we can predict future consequences from it, but we don't adjust budget numbers trying to show a smaller deficit than we're actually operating within. And then also the other issue is we don't have a separate capital budget. If we had a separate capital budget, all of a sudden the deficit numbers would look completely different. States separate out their capital budgets, looking at things such as roads, bridges, schools, and as a result they can borrow money by issuing bonds to pay for those things. The federal government just lumps it all into one massive category, and within that one massive category, we obviously end up in not great situations all the time. We also have what we call uncontrollable expenditures. The fact is, this is money that we're going to have to spend no matter what. Whether we want to, whether we don't want to. And if you look at Table 7.3 and you look at the differences, uncontrollable spending in 1976 was 36.3% of the federal budget. In 2010, it's 69.7%, which means the controllable piece has gone from the low 60s into just over 30%. That's a huge issue. That's a huge problem because it gives us less flexibility on what we can do. And this is a result of large entitlement programs, outstanding contracts. Really, the biggest chunk of the federal budget we have today that is actually controllable is defense spending. And that's somewhat of a third rail for a member of Congress. You don't want to touch defense spending because if you touch defense spending and something bad happens, the blame is going to fall on you. And then we also have what we call backdoor spending, spending decisions that get made outside of the formal appropriations process, which is an issue. First of all, you have the borrowing authority. There are agencies that are allowed to borrow money from Treasury for different things without going through the formal process. Student loan guarantees, mortgage guarantees are all examples. And we don't worry about it because the assumption is they will eventually be repaid. This is why student loan debt cannot be excused through bankruptcy provisions. We have contract authority. Agencies can enter into contracts that bind the federal government to pay a certain amount without going through the appropriations process. And they can do that, which basically leaves the federal government with one of two choices at the end. They can either A, pay the money, or B, renege on their debts. So there are ways for individual agencies to add very quickly to the federal budget deficit by simply going through their day-to-day operations. And then there are what we call permanent appropriations. These are public programs authorizing legislation that requires the agencies to spend money for purposes regardless of other conditions. Perfect example here is paying on the interest of the public debt. We have to do that no matter what. And in 2010, that was a huge number, more than 12% of total federal spending, right around $350 billion. We have what we call the overhang. In budget terms, what the overhang is talking about is the fact that there is lots of money in every annual budget that is simply obligated, not spent. In 2007, for example, we'd obligated $2.79 trillion to the federal budget, but in reality only $2.2 trillion had been spent, meaning there's money still hanging out there. There are problems that we see related to the overhang that come back with intergovernmental budget control. The states can choose to counteract the feds. If the federal government raises income taxes, the state governments can choose to decrease or lower their income taxes, or vice versa. We saw this with the Bush tax cuts. Bush drops the federal tax revenue, and the states go around and say, well, the people are already planning to spend that money, so we might as well get it. We have the difference between reprogramming and transfers. Reprogramming, if you want to think about it, the money's in one account, and we're simply shifting around where the money's going. So the book uses a great example looking at the Department of Agriculture. They may have separate appropriation accounts for crop supports. So you may have an account for cotton, wheat, corn, lima beans, whatever. If you are simply reprogramming, you are taking money within that account that was going towards cotton and giving it to corn. So it's staying in the same account, it's just shifting. And that's different from transfers, which are more serious, because you are taking money from one appropriations account to another. On that type of situation, you're going to have to try to convince Congress that what you're doing is right. So again, imagine Department of Agriculture, maybe you're going to take money from the lima bean account and give it to rural electrification or rural internet or something that will be an agriculture boom, but not necessarily what the money had originally been scheduled to go for. The defense budget causes us problems. The defense budget causes problems because, number one, there's a huge element of secrecy. Parts of the defense budget do not go through the traditional budgeting program because we basically say that what the budget is telling us is not information that should be publicly available. And then secondly, a lot of what Bush did was emergency supplemental appropriations. So he's going and saying, we have this huge crisis, we need the money. He's using the circumstance to drive the decision. Nobody again in Congress is going to say when a president says, so-and-so has blank weapons aimed at us, that we should really be going through a more formal process or accounting for the money. And we honestly prefer that way, because if we had to account for every possible catastrophe every year, money would go to defense or disaster relief, and just sit there and never be spent, which isn't good and isn't the fiscally sound way to do things. We have supplemental appropriations. There's lots of money involved in supplemental appropriations, and again, we're only talking $6, $7, $8 billion a year. But what's important is it's less scrutinized, so it's easier to go through on supplemental appropriations and try to get the money when you know it may not have gotten through the traditional way. And then we have earmarks. Earmark appropriations, special benefits for individuals. Congress doesn't want to overturn them because they want their own earmarks to exist. And if you look at the numbers, 587 earmarks in 1994 for defense appropriations bills. In 2006, there were just under 2,900, and that number has gone up. And what we need to realize is that every dollar we spend on an earmark is a dollar we're not spending on a program that may be more important or better suited or whatever it could be. Incrementalism. We are a country that loves incrementalism. Predictable change is based on successive limited comparisons. The best determinant of this year's budget is last year's budget. This is not fully rational. It is instead experiential. It is based on what we have seen and experience. It is cost minimizing. It's cost minimizing because it doesn't maximize benefits. What it really aims to do is have a seemingly easy process where agencies are never particularly surprised. It recognizes that so much of the budget is uncontrollable. And since it's uncontrollable, it's hard to have drastic changes. And plus, we're just an excessively conservative country on these types of issues. But at the same time, we need to recognize we aren't fully incremental in our process. Now, while the overall budget numbers for an agency may just vary differently from year to year, if you get down to the program level, we see programs every year that are getting zeroed out or getting created new. So we have non-incremental decisions being made within lower sub-levels of government at the program base. But at the higher level, it seems that it's always going to continue that what determines, the Department of Commerce's budget this year, the number one determinant is going to be the amount of money they had last year. Looking at alternatives. Program budgeting. Under the Johnson administration, the idea of trying to allocate resources based on the activities of government. From 301, this is the planning, programming, budgeting system that we had talked about. The steps are fairly simple. You identify goals, you develop programs to meet those goals, you allocate money to the programs, you recognize that organizations are not sacrosanct within PPBS, with the sense being that we are trying to tackle the problem, and if it takes 7 agencies to do so, so be it. You extend the time limit on expenditures found in line item budgeting, where you try to look at medium and long-term implications, not just short-term, and you search for efficiency and effectiveness. The hope out of PPBS is you get a more rigorous and rational budgeting system. You look at things like time and effort, which unfortunately for PPBS is difficult because it takes more time and it takes more effort. There is a fear of PPBS. People don't like that, you're going to have forced decisions being placed at a higher level of government. It worked for the Department of Defense. And it worked in the Department of Defense because McNamara believed in it. McNamara thought PPBS was the answer, that it was important to get out of just these budget silos and instead figure out how best can we, cure some problem, attack some problem, solve some problem. And if we look, program budgeting is still somewhat around today. When we passed the Government Performance and Results Act, GPRA, in 1993, we fundamentally shifted the way we assess government. We went from inputs such as personnel, budgets, whatever, to outputs and what government was accomplishing. And when we did that, it put the importance back on the individual programs to show that they're actually accomplishing their goals. Another opportunity for budgeting reform, the Jimmy Carter administration looking at zero-based budgeting, kind of this recognition that we need to be even more comprehensive in what we're doing. And under zero-based budgeting, you basically prepare a series of different decision packages. And they would all start with your survival package, lowest level of funding on which you could continue to exist. And then you would move up from there, kind of justifying, if given this, we could do blank. If I'm given X dollars, I will produce Y outputs. If given Z dollars, I will produce J outputs. So lots of different choices. This was geared towards multi-years. And it was geared toward making every agency or program defend every dollar they received. It was cost effective. The big concerns, number one, it threatens the existence of some agencies. You get scared. I have to justify every dollar. I may get zeroed out. Since we do annual budgeting, there was also no time to reconsider it every year. Having to go back and justify every penny you want just isn't a feasible solution. And it also creates conflict. All of a sudden it's zero-based budgeting, it's a zero-sum game. You're competing against everybody. So unlike PPBS, where we say organizations aren't sacrosanct, in a zero-based budgeting system, they basically have to be, or else they're worried about being steamrolled. More modern alternatives. We have Graham-Rudman-Hollins. Under Reagan, deficits grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. So we tried to create some type of legislation that would remove the discretion and force spending reductions in cases where Congress and the President couldn't come into agreement. So basically we're trying to figure out a way to make sure that we can curb the deficits and politics doesn't get in the way. And it really, originally, Graham-Rudman-Hollins aimed to reduce the federal deficit to zero within 5 years, which didn't ultimately happen, but we got fairly close. Two solutions here. You can either cut spending or raise taxes or use some combination. And if you can't agree on how to do that, we'd go into sequestration. The idea of just automatic cuts in spending with half of it coming from defense, half coming from domestic programs. They didn't reach the goal. They had to kind of expand the goal. But what we did end up seeing was the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990 being passed. And it provided for a series of new ways at looking at the budget that are still around today. First of all, it separates mandatory from discretionary spending, so the controllable versus uncontrollable. It differentiates 3 types of discretionary spending: defense, international, and domestic, with targets for each in terms of spending. It went to a pay-as-you-go plan, mandatory spending and revenues, so that any increase in spending or reduction in revenue required a spending reduction or tax increase everywhere, trying to make sure that everything was deficit neutral. It eliminated unrealistic targets. It included loan programs in the budget calculations, and then it allowed OMB to be the scorekeeper. So in 1990, they officially said OMB is going to be the one organization tasked with measuring the deficit and figuring out what exactly we need to do to get out. And that pay-go system is still around today, where spending bills have to be revenue neutral. If you were going to go out and say that you were going to increase something, if you need $100 million for a program, you're going to have to justify where that $100 million is coming from. The federal government is not willing to simply eat that cost. We had a balanced budget amendment. In 1993, it was almost ratified to be sent back to the states. It wasn't. The biggest concern with the balanced budget amendment is that planning happens so far in advance, and it is based on projections. How could you ever know what you're going to actually do in terms of a balance? So if it's June 2014 and I'm figuring out the October 2015 budget based on projections, how can I assure we're going to balance out in the end? And is it fair to keep updating that projection and tell agencies they have different spending targets throughout the entire budget process? Plus, you worry about the public trust angle. If you had a balanced budget amendment, a deficit would actually be a violation of the Constitution, and that would only further hinder public faith and trust in organizations, including Congress, the courts, the president, state and local governments. The line item veto. State governors have the line item veto. Republicans in Congress helped get Clinton the line item veto in 1996, and the goal was that by him having the line item veto, he could cut pet projects from spending bills. Because if you're the president today, they bring you a $800 million package, of which $3.2 million is a fluff pet project pork barrel for some individual senator. Your options as president prior to the line item veto, or do I veto the entire bill and send it back and not get the program up and running? Or do I just let that $3 million in fluff slide for the good of the program as a whole? The line item veto would allow you to cancel out the fluff and maintain the rest. There are some who argued that this would actually encourage Congress to put fluff in. It would pit Congress against the president in the sense that, I got a $80 million, I got an $80 million bridge put into the budget, and I would have had it for you, good constituents, except that President Obama line item vetoed it out of the budget. It's all his fault. Ultimately, it didn't last long. People who were negatively impacted by the line item veto very quickly challenged in courts, and ultimately won. It was found to be unconstitutional, violation of separation of powers, because the president in the executive branch was being given legislative powers that were obviously designed for members of Congress, not for the president. Where we are today is we talk about the idea of incrementalism, but the fact is most of America is looking for what we would call decrementalism, gradual reductions. And there's lots of debates on this as to whether it's a good idea to actually aim to spend less, and then more importantly, how do you go about doing this? The idea, if you think about your household budget, if we were going to decrementalize what you're doing, if we took $1 from your household budget every month for 12 months, you may not notice that the budget has even shrunk. If we do small amounts, we'll make small changes, but we still have to get buy-in. The fact is, it's simply just typically not good to go with across-the-board reductions in staffing levels of budgets and putting moratoriums on new programs and policies, but this is where we ultimately end up going. In 2011, we did it with the Budget Control Act. And the reason that we tend to fall back on things like this, it's based on less analysis. Since it's less analytical, it's less costly, it's less time-consuming. It's simpler to just say, I'm going to come in with an axe instead of come after you with a scalpel. And we've seen that change. You start talking program-based and zero-based budgeting. Those are scalpels. We're going through and cutting little pieces. What we talk about with decrementalism and the line item budget and the balanced budget, all of a sudden we're just hacking away and possibly cutting good things as well as things that cause problems for our country.